All right, so this week we are going to be in session 8 looking at Acts chapter 18. Before we get started, I just want you to know I am just thankful for each and every single one of you. I am just glad you guys are committed to helping, teaching, and growing in the discipleship in our church. And I can speak for the rest of the staff saying, hey, we're just very thankful for what you do. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to read verses 1 through 11, and then we'll jump to 18 through 21 at the end. But we'll start in Acts 18, the first 11 verses. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, and a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshipper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So this first passage is really interesting. So Paul is showing up to Corinth, and he's gone through a lot. He has dealt with a lot. He's got more to deal with, but if we read in First Corinthians, it kind of gives us a glimpse of him coming into Corinthians, and he was just feeling weak. He was, there was fear, there was trembling. He said that he did not, come with lofty speeches and wisdoms. He was drained. Just as you can expect, the man who had gone through all the persecution and attacks that he did, like he was at his end. Um, so he comes into Corinth, and before this, in Rome there had been a lot of anti-Semitism going on. All the Jews were getting pushed out, kicked out, told to leave, and all these things, which is how Priscilla and Aquila they ended up here. And so then Paul found them, and he began making tents with them. So what's kind of cool is that Paul was going to the synagogues on the Sabbath, but during the week he was supporting himself. He was working with them, in which this was typical of many Jewish rabbi. They would have a trade, and they would work to support themselves because they wouldn't take money from students and from their people they were teaching. And so they would have a trade during the week, and they would teach. And so Paul was doing this, and he was just, kind of working on the weekdays and preaching on the weekends, almost, if you want to kind of see it in a modern day kind of view, is what he was doing. He was just going hard. And the first kind of really note that I see here that I really caught on to is that God used this, first off, this bad thing, this racism, this anti-Semitism that was going on, to move people to be in the place that Paul needed them to be when he got there, so they were ready for him. So we already see, not necessarily directly with Paul, but with people in Paul's life, how God is taking some of these bad things happening all around and working them for his good, as we know he does. And you just kind of see little glimpses of that happening. And so it says that he was in the synagogue reasoning. This word, I really like this word reasoning. I was digging into it. It's from and excuse my Greek here, dialego, and it means to dispute, to discourse, to argue. It could kind of be a lot of things, but the main idea is he was actively presenting and defending and arguing for the gospel. Whether he was presenting it to people who were believing and just needed some help understanding, maybe it was sometimes, I'm sure, presenting to people who were against him and wanted him to stop and were trying to disprove him. Both of those reasons, he was actively presenting the gospel. He was fighting. It was working on the weekend to live, and then working for the eternal victories on the weekend. But then verse 5 here's a big turning point. Silas and Timothy come along. And they bring good news. He's close with them. After all he's gone through, like, you just have to imagine seeing his friends has got to be just a breath of fresh air. But not only that, they bring money, they bring financial support as well. So this is why it says Paul devoted all his time. This wasn't saying that Paul wasn't devoted to Christ and learning before. It's not some transition that, Paul was he's like only studying and doing it part time. He was living for Christ every day, but now he didn't have to work as much to support himself, so he could put all that time into being in the synagogue, into the discourse, into the dialogue, into the defenses and the arguing and all these things. And so that happens at this turning point when they get there to join him. So this first kind of question that it brings me to think about is, how does partnering with others help our ministry? How does doing ministry in groups oftentimes is easier than doing it alone? Now, there are situations where you may be the only physical person there in a situation, but how does doing ministry in groups help us? But also, it makes me think, personally, me, you, whoever, like, what are we doing to support others in their ministry? And I think of this in a way of not just like, well, I go to church and I give offering. Because I'm sure if we ask this question in our life groups, lots of people say, we give to the church, and the church supports missionaries. The church gives to this. We give to the 10 different offerings we have throughout the year. They go to the different mission boards and things like that. And those are great. But how are you personally, giving to just your life group, those beside you, your neighbors? How are you contributing to help them in ministry? Or are you not? Are you maybe living in ways that is harming others in ministry? Maybe you're not supporting them. Maybe that's a change. So there's a good kind of discussion point right there of how important is it to have others partnering with us in ministry, and are we even doing that for others? Do we have others doing that for us? You could spin that a lot of different ways. A really good discussion point there. So we keep going in verse 6. And then Paul begins to face opposition again. At this point, it's nothing new to him. Not saying it's easy, but he's gone through a lot. He's expecting opposition. When they begin to yell and fight him, and he gets angry, he has this just outburst, and he says, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean." He said, he's had enough. And he said, I'm going to go to the Gentiles, saying, hey, I've been teaching, I've been telling you this from so long now. And finally, he's just had enough. And after all that he's went through, he snapped. And he needed some encouragement. And so we see there are also some bits of good things happening too, though. We don't want to ignore and miss out what was happening at the synagogue, where Crispus was the leader, that he believed in the Lord with all his household, and that many Corinthians were there. They were hearing, they were being saved, they were being baptized. So there was good happening too, not to just make everything doom and gloom that Paul was just under attack and nothing good was coming out of it. There was good things coming out. There was also still reason that he was probably discouraged. He was under attack. He was all these things. But how in verses 9, he has the Lord speaking to him in the vision. And he starts out, do not be afraid any longer. And that phrase any longer also keys us in the fact that he has been struggling with this. It has been something going on. But go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you. No man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. God is just giving Paul in this moment the encouragement that he needs, and a very, I would say, you probably don't get more direct than that, than literally seeing God in the vision saying, hey, stop being afraid. I will protect you. I have my people in the city. And it's just another reminder again of that community of ministry together. God is saying, hey, there are people here to protect you, to help you. I've put them in this place for this reason. He said, now don't be afraid and let them help you. But one question that I really think of here is, what was Paul afraid of? I think it's reasonable to think at this point, Paul might have been afraid of success. And you're saying, well, that's a little bit strange. But think about this: the persecution, the attacks came when Paul was having his best moments. The more people were getting saved, the more success, and the more the gospel was moving, the harder the enemy was pushing in on him. So it wasn't that, I think Paul might have been afraid of success because he was worried, hey, I'm doing good here, good things are happening, and it's starting to boil over again. Saying, I'm seeing these great things, and that's what worries me. And again, I'm not Paul. I'm not going to stand in this place and say I know exactly, how he was thinking. But I'm saying that it's reasonable to think maybe that there was that line going. And it could be he was genuinely afraid of the persecution. He was genuinely afraid of failure. So what I think of here is, are we letting fear get in our way of following God's will? And that, again, this one could go, is your fear of success? Are you like Paul, saying, I really want to live for God's will, but I'm afraid that I'm going to do it too well and he's going to whisk me off somewhere else? Or you say, I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid of what's going to come when I go to share the gospel with this person who I know is just so against it. When I go in my workplace and start living like Christ and all the others that are just going to view me as that Christian, are you letting fear get in the way of living out God's will in the gospel? Are you going to stop being afraid any longer? Wherever the fear is coming from, are you going to stop? I found this quote. I couldn't find who said it, so if you know who quoted it, come let me know. I'd love to know where it came from. But it says this: it says, silence imprisons fear and boldness overcomes it. And I really like this idea. When you have this fear of success, failure, of even trying, whatever it may be, all silence does is lock it inside for it to keep growing and growing and growing. Boldness is what says, I'm going to go out and conquer it. I'm going to go out and take over it. And I think this is a good talking point too, is, why do we often let that fear be in prison? Why do we bottle it up sometimes? Why do we not want to overcome it? Maybe it's just because we think we're too afraid. Maybe we, feel like, well, what I'm afraid of is not big enough, and maybe God's got bigger things to handle. We have all these different thoughts. Why do we bottle it up? But also maybe talk about, hey, this is a good saying is, hey, when have you seen boldness in your life help you overcome fear? Or as you're teaching, maybe you have a story, and it could be as a kid, like the first time you jump off a diving board, you're standing up there, shaking at the top, like, I'm scared, and your mom or dad's in the water floating, like, just jump to me. And then that boldness is how you overcome fear. And then it's like, a week later, you're jumping off the diving board 100 times. They have to pry you away from the swimming pool. It's the same, the same idea here is like, when are we going to jump off that diving board into sharing our faith and just do it enough times where there's no fear. We're just bold. We're excited to do it. Where the missing out is from not doing it rather than being afraid of doing it. Where are we going to let that turn that fear into empowerment instead of imprisonment? And that's I think is a great talking point to kind of dwell on. And then the lesson jumps over to verse 18 through 21. And I'll read those. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. They came to Ephesus, he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus. So, just a few quick notes here. This vow and shaving his head, what was this deal? So this was most likely a Nazirite vow. It was a vow of devotion to God. So what many men would do, it prevented you, among other things, of eating certain foods, no strong drinks, no cutting your hair, certain things. So many men, right before they would take this vow, they would go shave and cut all their hair off. They would live out this vow, however long it was. And then at the end, they would cut their hair off again, all that had grown during that time, and offer it as an offering to God. And so this could have been what Paul was showing, was starting off that vow as, preparing an offering back to God. He leaves with Aquila and Priscilla, who we will see again, who are very important. And he went down to Ephesus briefly, and then says that, and he left pretty quickly. We get the idea that they were receptive because they wanted him to stay. They asked him to stay, but he told them they couldn't. But he said, I will return if God wills. And so this last question that I think of is, are you willing to follow God or just stay where you're comfortable? Because it seems here when Paul got to this little spot in Ephesus, like they wanted him to stay. He's reached a point where instead of preaching the gospel, he's getting stoned and imprisonment and all these things. They're like, hey, we want to hear more. And he's like, God's calling me somewhere else. Are you willing when life gets comfortable, when you finally get that job you love, when you get that place you love, you're in the perfect neighborhood or the perfect town with the perfect job, your kids are in the perfect schools, all these things, and God says, all right, it's time to pack it up. I've got a new plan for you. I've got a new place for you. Whatever aspect that may be, are you prepared to leave the comfortable and go into the uncomfortable? And that comes back to that boldness. Are you prepared to have that boldness to continue on? This is a great lesson this week. I pray that your life groups are open with open minds and open hearts as you teach this week. I pray that you just continue just to embolden and empower your groups, and that the word of the Lord just encourages you guys and convicts you guys and just helps you all grow closer to Him. Thank y'all.